The boardroom smells like expensive coffee and leather when the new VP stops mid-presentation at 2:34 p.m. on a Thursday and points directly at me. His tablet screen is projected on the wall behind him, showing compensation data he shouldn't have access to. Wesley Hartwell, Senior Strategic Counsel. Base compensation $520,000. He pauses for effect, letting the number hang in the air. That's what we're paying for overpaid and obsolete thinking, gentlemen. The room goes silent. Then someone laughs nervously. The CFO shifts in his seat. The CEO stares at his phone. I sit perfectly still, my face burning, while the VP smiles like he's just made a brilliant point. But something catches my eye on his tablet. A contract clause reference in the footer of his slide. Section 14.7, C. I helped draft that section 9 months ago. It shouldn't be on a presentation about compensation optimization. My chest tightens. 6 months earlier, I walked into Apex Global's headquarters for my first day as Senior Strategic Counsel, a role created specifically for me after I'd helped another firm avoid a $340 million regulatory penalty through careful contract review. The General Counsel shook my hand warmly. Wesley, we brought you here because we need someone who sees what others miss. Our contracts are complex, and we're scaling fast. We can't afford blind spots. My division had tripled client retention the previous year by restructuring liability clauses and risk-sharing agreements that made long-term partnerships sustainable. Leadership respected the work. They valued precision. They understood that $520,000 wasn't about prestige. It was insurance against catastrophic oversights. For 6 months, everything worked. The contracts were sound. The clients were stable. The revenue was predictable. Then the new VP arrived with PowerPoints and ambition, and everything shifted. His first week, the VP walked through every department like a campaign tour, shaking hands and praising work he didn't understand. He stopped by my office on a Tuesday afternoon, leaned against the doorframe with practiced casualness, and said, "Wesley, I've heard great things. Your attention to detail is legendary around here. I'm looking forward to working together." I thanked him. He smiled and left. That Friday, he sent an email to the executive team outlining strategic realignment priorities that included streamlining legal review processes to accelerate deal velocity. My name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was clear. I was slowing things down. The following week, he presented a client retention analysis that included metrics I'd developed, rebranded under his strategic framework. My work. His slide deck. No attribution. In meetings, he started subtly contradicting my recommendations, framing caution as fear and thoroughness as delay. He never directly attacked me. He just made me invisible while taking credit for outcomes I'd built. Late on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the VP arrived, I was reviewing contracts for an upcoming $4.8 billion infrastructure partnership with Consolidated Energy Partners. The deal had been in negotiation for 11 months, structured carefully to balance risk across multiple jurisdictions. I was doing final verification before execution when I found something that stopped me cold. Section 14.7, C, buried on page 127 of the master agreement, contained language I didn't recognize. It was a liability provision tying financial penalties to performance benchmarks that seemed reasonable on the surface, standard stuff. But the calculation methodology referenced an appendix that didn't exist. The missing appendix meant the penalty could be interpreted as uncapped. Worse, the triggering conditions were vague enough that almost any operational variance could activate the clause. I read it 4 times. This wasn't my language. This wasn't our standard template. Someone had altered it. I checked the version history. The change was made 6 days ago. The editor was listed as Executive Review, Final Approval. Thursday morning at 9:47 a.m., I walked into the General Counsel's office with a contract printed and annotated. She looked up from her laptop, surprised. "Wesley, what's going on?" I placed the contract on her desk, open to section 14.7, C. This clause wasn't in the previous draft. The liability calculation references a missing appendix, which means the penalties are effectively undefined. If this goes through as written, we could be exposed to claims we can't quantify. She scanned the section, her expression neutral. It looks standard to me. Performance-based penalties are normal in infrastructure contracts. Not when the calculation methodology is missing. The appendix it references doesn't exist. She closed the contract slowly. Wesley, this has been through multiple reviews. Legal, finance, executive approval. If there was a problem, someone would have flagged it. I pressed. Who approved this version? She hesitated, then said quietly, it came from the VP's office. Final edits before signature. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm sure it's fine. Let's not overcomplicate this. The deal closes Monday. I left her office knowing she wasn't convinced. She was scared. Monday afternoon, I sat in a conference room with the Consolidated Energy Partners executive team for the final contract presentation. The VP was leading, polished and confident, walking them through key terms with the ease of someone who'd never read the fine print. I was there as technical support, expected to nod and answer detailed questions if they arose. Halfway through his presentation, he reached the performance benchmark section. He started explaining the penalty structure, and I noticed immediately, he was using different numbers than what was in the contract. He said penalties were capped at 12% of contract value. The clause, as written, had no cap. I interrupted. Excuse me, but the language in section 14.7, C, doesn't specify that cap. The calculation references Appendix J, which isn't included in the final document. The VP stopped mid-sentence. The client team looked confused. He recovered quickly, laughing lightly. Wesley's being thorough, as always. The cap is implied by the performance standards outlined earlier. It's effectively the same thing. It wasn't the same thing. Not even close. But he moved on before I could clarify. After the meeting, he pulled me aside in the hallway. Don't contradict me in front of clients again. You're here to support, not second guess. Back at my desk, I pulled up every version of the Consolidated Energy contract and compared them line by line. The original draft, the one I'd worked on for months, had clear penalty caps and a complete appendix structure. The version presented today was different. Key protections had been removed. Language had been softened. The liability provisions were now ambiguous at best, catastrophic at worst. I built a comparison document showing every change, timestamped and attributed. Most of the alterations happened in a 72-hour window 2 weeks ago, right after the VP took over final contract approvals. The pattern was clear. He was prioritizing deal velocity over risk management. He wanted this closed fast, and my careful language was in the way. This wasn't sloppy work. It was intentional. He was gambling that the ambiguities wouldn't matter, that the client would perform flawlessly, that the risks would never materialize. And if I was right about the clause, he was gambling with the company's survival. Tuesday morning, HR called me in. The director sat across from me with a tight smile and a script she'd clearly rehearsed. Wesley, we've received feedback that you've been resistant to some of the new strategic directions. The VP mentioned you've been pushing back on process improvements, creating friction in client interactions. I kept my voice even. I raised a concern about a contract clause that exposes us to undefined liability. That's my job. She nodded sympathetically. We understand you're thorough, but sometimes thoroughness can slow momentum. We're asking you to be more collaborative, to trust the team's collective judgment. The team's collective judgment missed a clause that could cost us hundreds of millions if it's triggered. She stiffened. That's a serious accusation. Have you documented these concerns formally? I raised them with the general counsel. And what did she say? She said it was fine. HR leaned back. Then maybe it is. Wesley, we need you to tone down the pushback. Work with the VP, not against him. Can you do that? I understood then. HR wasn't mediating. They were managing me. The VP had more political capital than I did, and they'd chosen sides. Wednesday at 3:22 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email from Harrison Cole, the CFO of Consolidated Energy Partners. The subject line was Section 14.7, C, clarification needed. My stomach dropped. The email was brief. Wesley, our legal team has been reviewing the final contract and flagged some ambiguities in the performance penalty structure. Specifically, Section 14.7, C, references an appendix that wasn't included in the executed document. This creates uncertainty around how penalties would be calculated in the event of performance variances. We're considering pausing implementation until this is resolved. Can you provide clarity? I read it 3 times. The client had spotted exactly what I'd warned about. They were spooked. A $4.8 billion partnership was now in jeopardy because the VP had rushed a flawed contract through approval. I forwarded the email to the General Counsel and the VP without comment. The VP's response came back in 9 minutes. This is a minor administrative issue. We'll provide an addendum clarifying the appendix. No need to alarm the client. But the client was already alarmed. And they had every right to be. I stopped reacting emotionally. I stopped arguing in meetings. I just started documenting everything. Every email. Every contract version. Every conversation where concerns were dismissed. I created a secure folder and backed it up to my personal encrypted storage. I timestamped every entry. I saved metadata showing who edited what and when. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was building a record of what actually happened. If this went sideways, I wanted proof that I'd raised the alarm. I wanted evidence that the problems weren't oversights, they were decisions. Conscious choices made by people who prioritized speed over safety. I kept working. I kept showing up. I kept my head down. But I was ready. Friday afternoon, the VP cornered me in the hallway outside the executive suite. His friendly mask was gone. He leaned in close, voice low and tight. I know what you're doing, Wesley. You're trying to undermine this deal because you're threatened by new leadership. But here's the reality. You're expensive, you're slow, and you're making yourself obsolete. Keep pushing, and you'll find yourself reviewing contracts for a much smaller company. Are we clear? I looked at him calmly. I'm doing my job. If that feels like a threat, maybe the problem isn't me. His jaw tightened. We'll see. He walked away. I stood there in the empty hallway, my heart pounding but my resolve steady. Something bigger was in play, and I wasn't backing down. The following Tuesday, I was waiting for the elevator on the ground floor when a junior analyst from finance appeared beside me. She glanced around nervously, then pressed a USB drive into my palm. I can't stay, she whispered. But you need to see what's on this. I'm resigning tomorrow. Good luck. She turned and walked quickly toward the exit before I could respond. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside, the drive hidden in my closed fist. I didn't look at it until I was back at my desk with the door closed. The drive contained internal contract edits, email chains, and version control logs. Someone had systematically tracked every change the VP made to the consolidated energy contract. The metadata showed intentional deletions of protective language, deliberate removal of penalty caps, and emails where the VP explicitly instructed legal to simplify clauses that he called deal killers. There were 19 documents total. Every one of them proved the changes weren't mistakes. They were strategy. I scheduled a meeting with the General Counsel for Thursday morning. This time, I didn't just bring annotations. I brought the drive. I walked into her office, closed the door, and placed it on her desk. You need to see this. She looked at the drive like it might explode. What is it? Evidence that the contract changes were intentional. The VP systematically removed protective clauses to accelerate the deal. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. She picked up the drive slowly, her hands shaking slightly. She inserted it into her laptop and opened the first file. Her face went pale as she read. She clicked through 3 more files, then stopped. She removed the drive and handed it back to me. Wesley, you cannot share these documents. Do you understand me? Not with anyone. Why not? Because this implicates senior leadership in decisions that could expose the company to massive liability. If this gets out, it won't just hurt the VP. It'll hurt all of us. So we just ignore it. She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm telling you, as your counsel, do not spread these files. Let me handle this internally. I took the drive and left. She wasn't going to handle it. She was going to bury it. Within a week, word spread quietly through back channels. Clients started asking careful questions about contract terms. Other partnerships in negotiation slowed down as legal teams requested additional reviews. The stock price dipped 4% over 3 trading days on no public news, just vague investor unease. The VP maintained his public confidence, smiling through presentations and conference calls. But in private meetings, I saw the cracks. His laugh was forced. His answers were defensive. He snapped at assistants. He spent more time behind closed doors with the CEO and CFO. Consolidated Energy Partners formally requested a third-party audit of the contract terms before proceeding with implementation. The request was polite but firm. They wanted independent verification that the performance penalties were enforceable and fair. The VP tried to frame it as routine diligence. No one believed him. On a Monday morning, Harrison Cole sent another email. This one was shorter and colder. We'll proceed with the partnership only if Apex Global's leadership undergoes an independent compliance audit related to contract governance. We need assurance that internal controls are sufficient to prevent future ambiguities. We're giving you 2 weeks to initiate the process. Otherwise, we'll need to reconsider our options. 2 weeks. The client was drawing a line. They were saying, fix this, or we walk. A $4.8 billion partnership hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. I forwarded the email to the general counsel and marked it urgent. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. I opened my calendar and marked the deadline. 14 days from today. I didn't know if the company would survive the audit. I didn't know if I would survive the fallout. I just knew the truth was coming, whether we were ready or not. 3 days later, internal memos started leaking. Someone, maybe the analyst who gave me the drive, maybe someone else, forwarded preliminary compliance findings to a wider distribution list than intended. The findings were damning. Contract governance showed material inconsistencies in recent approvals. Version control protocols had been bypassed. Protective clauses had been removed without documented justification. The VP tried to spin it. He sent a company-wide email attributing the discrepancies to aggressive market conditions and evolving client expectations. He framed the changes as strategic adaptations, not errors. But the language was too defensive. The explanations too vague. People weren't buying it. The stock dropped another 6%. Analysts started asking questions on earnings calls. Clients requested reassurances. Partners paused negotiations. The crisis was no longer contained. It was spreading. The board called an emergency session for Friday. The agenda was simple: contract governance review and corrective action. They ordered a full forensic audit of every major contract approved in the past 6 months. They brought in an external firm specializing in corporate compliance. And they pulled me onto the review team. The general counsel called me into her office Thursday afternoon. The board wants you on the audit team because you have the deepest knowledge of our contract structures. You'll work directly with the external auditors. Full access. Full transparency. I nodded. Understood. She hesitated. Wesley, the VP is aware you'll be involved. He's not happy about it, but he didn't object. I think he's underestimating you. Good. She looked at me for a long moment. Be careful. If this audit finds what I think it will, people are going to look for someone to blame. Make sure you're protected. I was already protected. I had the drive. I had the documentation. I had the emails. I just needed the audit to uncover what I already knew. Late Friday night, I was alone in my office reviewing audit materials when my door flew open. The VP stormed in, his face flushed, his tie loosened. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You think you're clever, don't you? Feeding information to auditors, playing the whistleblower. Let me be very clear, if you try to pin this on me, I will bury you. I have lawyers. I have resources. I will sue you into the ground for defamation, for breach of confidentiality, for anything I can make stick. I stayed seated, my hands folded on the desk. I haven't pinned anything on anyone. I just answered the auditor's questions honestly. Bullshit. You've been building a case against me since day one. I've been doing my job. If that looks like a case against you, maybe the problem is your decisions, not my documentation. He leaned over my desk, his voice dropping to a hiss. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This goes higher than you think. You keep pushing, and you'll find out just how expendable you really are. He left, slamming the door behind him. I sat there in the silence, my heart racing but my mind clear. He was panicking, and panicking people make mistakes. Monday morning, the general counsel handed me a draft NDA. It was 7 pages long, dense with legal language designed to bind me to permanent silence about proprietary company processes and strategic decisions. Signing it would mean I couldn't discuss the contract issues, the audit findings, or anything related to the VP's decisions. Ever. They want this signed by end of day, she said quietly. It's not optional. I read it carefully. The language was airtight. If I signed, I'd be legally barred from revealing anything, even if subpoenaed. Even if the truth went public through other channels. I'd be silenced permanently, and the company would be protected from my testimony. I set the document down. I'm not signing this. She closed her eyes. Wesley, they'll fire you if you refuse. Then they'll fire me. But I'm not signing away the truth. If the facts come out through the audit, that's the company's problem, not mine. I'm not going to help them bury evidence. She didn't argue. She just took the document back and left. 2 hours later, HR called asking me to reconsider. I declined. By the end of the day, I was placed on administrative leave pending resolution of the audit findings. They wanted me gone, but they couldn't fire me yet. Not while the audit was active. The audit team found the analyst's backup files. She'd resigned 3 weeks earlier, but before leaving, she'd submitted a formal archive of her work to the compliance department, complete with time-stamped metadata showing exactly when the VP authorized each contract edit. The files were devastating. They showed emails where the VP explicitly instructed legal to remove penalty caps. They showed internal memos where he bragged about cutting through bureaucratic red tape to close deals faster. They showed version control bypasses authorized under his credentials. Every piece of evidence pointed directly at him. The metadata destroyed any possibility of plausible deniability. The changes weren't accidental. They weren't collaborative. They were top-down directives from the VP, executed by teams who trusted his authority. He'd gambled that speed would matter more than safety. He'd lost. The board convened on a Wednesday morning in the executive conference room. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it later from the general counsel. The auditors presented their findings methodically, walking through each contract irregularity, each bypassed control, each unauthorized edit. The VP sat stone-faced, his lawyer beside him. When the auditors reached section 14.7c of the Consolidated Energy Contract, the room went silent. They explained that the missing appendix created undefined liability exposure. They showed calculations suggesting that if the performance triggers were activated, the penalties could exceed $700 million based on the vague language. $700 million in exposure because one appendix was missing and one clause was poorly written. The VP tried to spin the narrative. He argued the clause was a drafting error, not a strategic decision. He claimed legal had signed off on it. He suggested the auditors were overreacting to hypothetical scenarios. But the clause was there, in writing, approved under his authority. And the auditors had emails proving he'd pushed to remove the protective language I'd originally drafted. In a final desperate move, the VP produced a document he claimed proved I'd been the one who removed the appendix and altered the clause. It was an email chain, time-stamped 3 weeks before the contract was finalized, showing edits attributed to my user account. He placed it on the table dramatically. This shows Wesley Hartwell made the changes. He's been trying to frame me for his own mistakes. For a moment, the room hesitated. The document looked legitimate. The timestamps lined up. My username was there in the metadata. The VP's lawyer started talking about malicious intent, about rogue employees, about the need to investigate me instead of his client. Then the lead auditor asked to see the file's forensic metadata. They ran it through verification software while the room waited in tense silence. 3 minutes later, the auditor looked up, his expression grim. This document was created last week. The metadata has been forged. The edits attributed to Mr. Hartwell never happened. This is fabricated evidence. The silence that followed was absolute. The VP's face went white. His lawyer started talking frantically about misunderstandings, about administrative errors, but no one was listening. The board chair cut him off. You just submitted forged evidence in a formal audit. We're done here. The forensic analysis continued. The auditors explained that the forged document triggered additional liability under Section 14.7 (c), because falsifying contract records constituted a material breach under the performance standards. The clause I'd been warning about, the one with undefined penalties, now applied to the VP's own misconduct. The penalties, calculated conservatively based on contract value and breach severity, totaled $710 million. $710 million in liability triggered by a clause the VP himself had approved, weaponized by evidence he tried to fabricate. The irony was crushing. The room stayed silent as the number settled in. The CFO looked physically ill. The CEO stared at the table. The board chair asked quietly, "Can we settle this?" The auditors shook their heads. Consolidated Energy has already been briefed on these findings. They're invoking the clause. It's binding. The board fired the VP immediately. No severance. No transition period. Security escorted him out of the building within the hour. His lawyer threatened legal action, but everyone knew it was empty bluster. The evidence was overwhelming. The forgery alone would keep him in court for years. Consolidated Energy Partners formally invoked Section 14.7 (c), demanding penalties for material breach of contract governance. The company's lawyers tried to negotiate, but the clause was airtight. Ironically, it was one of the few parts of the contract that wasn't ambiguous. The penalties were enforceable. The exposure was real. Regulators stepped in, opening investigations into contract compliance and internal controls. The stock plummeted 23% in a single day. Clients canceled partnerships. Competitors circled. The VP's 3-month tenure had cost the company $710 million, its reputation, and its stability. He pleaded for leniency in press statements, claiming he'd been trying to help the company move faster. No one listened. The damage was done. 2 weeks later, the board issued a formal statement clearing my name. They acknowledged I'd raised concerns about Section 14.7 (c) repeatedly and that those concerns had been dismissed. They praised my integrity and diligence in protecting the company's interests. Clients called asking me to personally review their contracts. My administrative leave was lifted. I was offered a promotion to general counsel with expanded authority and a $340,000 raise. I turned it down. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I'd spent months fighting to protect a company that only valued me after catastrophe struck. I'd been called overpaid and obsolete while preventing a $710 million disaster. I'd been threatened, sidelined, and nearly silenced for doing my job correctly. I accepted a role at a smaller firm with a culture that valued precision over speed. The title was the same. The pay was comparable. But the respect was immediate. No one questioned my worth. No one mocked my salary. They hired me because they understood that careful work isn't expensive. It's insurance. I didn't walk away to punish anyone. I walked away because I'd learned something essential. Arrogance always collects its debt. The VP thought he was smarter than the details. He thought speed mattered more than accuracy. He thought he could humiliate me into silence and erase my work with bravado and forged documents. He was wrong on every count. The clause that cost them $710 million was the one I'd tried to fix. The evidence that destroyed him was the documentation I'd quietly maintained. The vindication I received came not from revenge, but from simply being right and refusing to be silenced. In the end, the numbers didn't lie. The contracts didn't forget. And the truth, carefully documented and patiently preserved, outlasted every threat. I didn't need the last word. The clause gave it to me.